January 30th, 1944. Bougainville, Solomon Islands. The jungle is breathing. Damp air thick with smoke. A column of Japanese Type 95 tanks crawls through the palms, their engines growling low, treads grinding over coral and crushed ferns. In the shadows, 2 U.S. Marines kneel behind a log. One steadies a green metal tube, its paint chipped from salt and sand. The other slides a rocket into the breach, whispers a number, a hiss. Then a sudden streak of flame cuts the dark. The rocket slams into the tank's flank. A brief pause. Then a hollow thud, followed by a violent burst of orange. The turret lurches upward, smoke belching out. Inside, the crew never stands a chance. The rest of the tanks hesitate, unsure. To the Japanese commander's eye, the Americans had fired something absurd. A shoulder pipe, not a cannon. A toy, he had called it days before. But in that instant, the Pacific War had shifted. A 15-pound rocket launcher had just rewritten what an infantryman could do to a tank. By early 1943, the Pacific War had reached a brutal equilibrium. Japan's early expansion had stalled, and island by island, the Allies were beginning the long, grinding push westward. Each patch of jungle or coral was a fortress, not because of its geography alone, but because Japanese commanders had built their defenses around the notion that no infantry weapon could stop a tank once it advanced. In the Pacific, Japanese armor wasn't about sweeping armored thrusts like in Europe. It was a tool of shock, a way to crush dug-in infantry and break morale. Their main vehicles, the Type 95 Heigo light tank and Type 97 Chiha medium tank, were lightly armored by European standards, but formidable to troops armed with rifles, grenades, or satchel charges. The Hago's riveted plates were barely 12 mm thick on the sides, but against Marines pinned in trenches, it felt invincible. The U.S. response to armor had been clumsy at first. In 1942, most Marine and Army units in the Pacific carried the 37th Letulumiwilu M3 anti-tank gun, a weapon that required clear fields of fire and steady hands. In the jungle, there were neither. Soldiers resorted to improvised explosives, Molotov cocktails, or magnetic mines, all of which demanded suicidal proximity. The men who faced Japanese tanks in the early Solomon campaigns knew one truth. If a tank rolled up to your foxhole, survival meant crawling beneath it and hoping your charge went off before you did. Meanwhile, far away in the laboratories of the U.S. Army Ordnance Department, engineers had been experimenting with a new idea, a rocket-propelled grenade, using a shaped explosive that could burn through armor not by speed, but by chemistry. This was the M1 rocket launcher, soon nicknamed the bazooka. Its principle was elegantly lethal. When the warhead struck metal, a small cone-shaped cavity focused explosive energy into a narrow jet of molten copper, slicing through armor like a hot blade through butter. Unlike bullets or shells that relied on velocity, this weapon depended on design. A man could now destroy a tank without dragging an artillery piece through the jungle. The first bazookas were crude. A thin steel tube 54 inches long weighing 13 pounds. Effective range? Barely 100 yards, and even that depended on courage and calm under fire. Its electric firing system misfired in humidity. The rocket's backblast could reveal the shooter's position instantly. But despite the flaws, it was revolutionary. A weapon small enough for a single infantryman, yet capable of piercing 75 mm of armor. To Japanese intelligence, reports of this new device seemed exaggerated. They had never seen a true anti-tank rocket in the field. Their doctrine still assumed American infantry needed artillery support to disable armor. The notion that a soldier with a shoulder-fired tube could kill a tank sounded like fantasy, or a desperate morale booster. As the Allies prepared for their next push through the Solomons, crates of the new weapon began appearing in supply dumps marked 2.36-inch rocket launcher, M1A1. Marines unwrapped them like experimental tools, unsure whether they'd work or blow up in their faces. Many early operators practiced by firing into wrecks or coral embankments, watching the jet of molten metal gouge clean holes through steel. The Marines quickly saw its value and its danger. It required teamwork, discipline, and positioning. It could not stop a tank head-on. It demanded patience, waiting for the perfect flank shot at 30 or 40 yards. But when it hit, it worked. Still, command skepticism lingered. Officers considered it an auxiliary weapon, a rocket gun to be tried when nothing else sufficed. Even some of its users nicknamed it the toy. In the jungles of Bougainville, the men would soon discover that the toy had teeth. By mid-1943, the Pacific War had become a lesson in adaptation. Each island presented its own maze of coral, ridges, and humid jungle. The Marines learned to fight in narrow clearings and dense canopies, where visibility was a few dozen yards at best. In that world, tanks were blind giants. When the M1A1 bazooka reached frontline units on New Georgia and Bougainville, its operators were often self-taught. A Marine would fire a few practice rounds, note the rocket's slow arc, and then figure out the rest in combat. The Army issued field manuals, but theory meant little in knee-deep mud with mosquitoes swarming your eyes. The real test came when the Type 95s began moving again. The Japanese believed the terrain made them untouchable. Their armor tactics emphasized speed and fear, rushing the perimeter at night, crushing foxholes under treads, and using the tank's machine guns to rake the undergrowth. The Type 95 Hago, with its 37mm main gun, wasn't built to fight Shermans. It was built to terrify infantry. Against Australians and early U.S. forces in 1942, it worked. The noise alone shattered nerves. But that equation was changing. The bazooka's warhead could penetrate the Hago's thin armor from nearly any angle. Even the heavier Type 97 Chiha, Japan's best medium tank, was vulnerable from the sides and rear. The challenge wasn't power, it was range and exposure. To get that side shot, the gunner had to hold his ground until the tank was almost within grenade distance. This demanded a new kind of courage. Cold, patient, time to the second. Bazooka men learned to hide the launch tube under wet leaves, to wait for the tank's silhouette to cross a gap in the trees, to breathe once before pressing the trigger. Early combat reports stunned Allied intelligence officers. Marines claimed single teams had destroyed 3 or 4 tanks in a night, using only a handful of rockets. They fired from trenches, from trees, even from inside bomb craters. After one engagement on New Georgia, a Japanese platoon commander wrote that his tanks were being attacked by flame weapons that pierced the hull. To him, it looked like witchcraft, but success came at a cost. The launcher's backblast, a burst of fire and smoke, revealed the gunner's position instantly. Many were cut down by machine gun fire moments after firing. Some tried digging shallow pits behind them to absorb the blast. Others built crude baffles from sandbags. Still, it was worth the risk. The weapon gave infantrymen something they'd never had before: power over armor. As 1944 approached, the bazooka was no longer an experiment. Every Marine platoon received at least one, and training intensified. The 236-inch rocket was improved with a sturdier fuse, and spare parts were shipped in waterproof containers. Veterans shared tactics with newcomers: how to angle shots, how to aim at engine decks, how to carry rockets in waxed paper to keep them dry. The Japanese, however, were slow to adapt. Their tank doctrine assumed infantry support could neutralize close-range threats, and their armor development program had stalled due to resource shortages. They had no countermeasure to the shaped charge. Their tanks lacked the armor or mobility to fight defensively. By the time the Americans landed on Bougainville in November 1943, the stage was set. Japanese forces would counterattack with armor, unaware that the rules had changed. Night would fall. The jungle would come alive with engines and shouting, and in the shadows, a few men armed with toy rockets would meet steel with fire. The tanks were coming, and the bazooka teams were waiting. Angle 1. The human angle, 2 men and a tube. Every bazooka. Story begins the same way. 2 men breathing through the stench of diesel and mud, waiting for something huge to emerge from the smoke. One kneels, gripping the launcher like a lifeline. The other crouches behind, his hands trembling as he slides a rocket into place. Loader and gunner, a team whose lives depend on each other's steadiness. The Marine gunner's world narrows to a sightpost, a metal tube, and the sound of a tank's gears grinding closer. The loader whispers, "Ready!" The trigger is pressed. A flash of white. The recoil kicks dust into their faces. For an instant, both are deaf, blinded by backblast. Then, the explosion. These moments built a strange intimacy. Many Marines later recalled that firing the bazooka wasn't about anger or glory. It was about trust. The loader's hands, the gunner's aim, the split-second decision that might save a squad. They were improvisers, soldiers turned engineers, using scavenged sandbags and bamboo for rests. The Japanese tanks came on in silence except for the clatter of treads and the faint metallic whine. In those seconds before firing, men felt utterly alone. One Marine from the 3rd Division would later say, "When you see that tank's gun point at you, the tube feels like a stick. But if you hold, just hold, you find out what it can do." That was the human equation behind the so-called toy. It wasn't the rocket that made the difference. It was the nerve to stay put when everything else screamed to run. Angle 2. The technological angle, the science of shaped fire. The bazooka didn't rely on brute force. It relied on precision chemistry. Inside its warhead sat a conical cavity lined with copper. When the explosive detonated, the energy focused inward, forming a narrow jet of molten metal traveling at nearly 8,000 meters per second. That jet didn't explode the armor. It pierced it, vaporizing steel and spraying shrapnel and heat through the interior. Crewmen inside were killed not by the blast itself, but by molten fragments ricocheting in the confined space. It was, in essence, a man-portable armor scalpel. For the first time, infantry could bypass the age-old equation of firepower versus thickness. A shaped charge ignored speed, ignored range. It cared only about angle and detonation distance. The bazooka's penetration didn't depend on the soldier's strength or the tube's barrel length. It was science doing what bullets could not. The Japanese tanks, designed for mobility and colonial warfare, were simply not built to survive it. Their armor, 12 to 25 millimeters thick, might stop rifle fire but not focused chemistry. Against the bazooka's jet, it behaved like wet paper. It was the beginning of a technological truth that would define post-war combat. That small portable precision could replace heavy mass. On the beaches of the Pacific, that revelation came in the form of a soft whoosh, followed by fire. Angle 3. The enemy's miscalculation. Commanders of steel and pride in Japanese doctrine. The tank was a symbol of moral power. It was meant to terrify, to dominate, to embody the emperor's unstoppable will. Commanders in 1943 had little reason to believe that American infantry could counter armor at all. Reports of a new rocket gun reached Japanese intelligence late and confused. Sketches captured from Allied manuals showed a crude tube, barely more than a meter long. Officers in Rabaul reportedly laughed at the idea. "It is an anti-tank toy," one memo read. "Our tanks will withstand it." That confidence was fatal. The Type 95's armor had been sufficient against Chinese nationalist forces and early colonial troops, but the Pacific was changing. When the bazooka appeared, Japanese crews found themselves fighting an invisible enemy, one that could appear, fire, and vanish into the trees. Tank commanders began reporting mysterious explosions from the sides or rear, followed by total loss of crew. At first, they blamed mines or artillery. Only later did they realize that small teams of Americans, sometimes only 2 men, were stalking them with shoulder-fired weapons. For an army raised on the belief that courage conquered technology, it was a psychological shock. Tanks that once symbolized invulnerability now advanced with fear. Commanders began ordering infantry screens thicker, counterattacks smaller, and armor movement restricted to night or fog. The toy rocket had shattered not just steel but the illusion of superiority that had fueled Japanese ground doctrine since Manchuria. The tide of innovation and disbelief was converging. As both sides adjusted, leadership and terrain would soon decide the outcome. Angle 4. Leadership and adaptation. Turning innovation into doctrine weapons. Alone don't change wars. People do. The early success of the bazooka was chaotic. Isolated teams improvising tactics, firing positions, and timing. But by 1944, U.S. platoon leaders were turning the weapon from novelty into doctrine. In field briefings under canvas, officers emphasized 3 rules: flank the armor, fire once, and move immediately. Infantry platoons began structuring their defense lines with bazooka teams placed in overlapping arcs. They paired them with bars, Browning automatic rifles, to suppress accompanying infantry, and 37mm guns to finish off any tanks that survived the first salvo. This was leadership born from adaptation. Not grand strategy, but hard-earned field wisdom. At Bougainville and later Peleliu, junior leaders were often the ones refining tactics, sketching firing arcs on ration boxes, and teaching replacements how to load under pressure. A lieutenant in the 1st Marine Division once described it bluntly: "We used to pray for artillery when tanks came. Now, if I had 2 bazooka teams, I could hold a ridge." The Japanese, in contrast, lacked the same flexibility. Their command hierarchy discouraged initiative. Orders flowed downward, even in chaos. Once the tanks rolled, local commanders had little autonomy to adapt when the unexpected happened. The Americans, meanwhile, adjusted in real time, moving teams, reloading, exploiting every flank. The bazooka had become not just a weapon, but a mindset. The belief that precision, timing, and small unit coordination could counter brute force. Angle 5. Terrain and the hidden battlefield. The islands of the Pacific were unlike any European front. Instead of open plains and defined lines, there were tangled jungles, volcanic ridges, and coral cliffs. Visibility rarely extended beyond 50 yards. In such terrain, tanks were blind predators, powerful yet trapped in narrow corridors. For the bazooka teams, this was an advantage. Coral outcroppings made natural ambush points. Fallen trees and ridges provided cover for approach and escape. In dense foliage, the rocket's backblast was muffled, and smoke blended into the haze of burning vegetation. Terrain shaped every engagement. A well-placed team could halt an entire column by knocking out the lead tank, forcing the rest to pivot awkwardly or retreat. Marines learned to target the track section rather than the turret, disabling mobility first. Others aimed for engine vents or fuel tanks, knowing that even a partial penetration could ignite the interior. On Peleliu, the volcanic ridges gave bazooka teams the perfect stage. Firing from high ground, they could hit tanks from above, the weakest point in Japanese armor. Veterans recalled the eerie sight of molten metal pouring through a turret roof, followed by silence. The geography of the Pacific turned the bazooka from a defensive weapon into an ambush tool, a scalpel in a surgeon's jungle theater. Every hill, every tree root, every hollow in the coral became part of the weapon's effectiveness. Angle 6. The moral equation. Courage at 40 yards. There was a moment, always the same, when the distance closed to 40 yards. That was where courage lived. Unlike artillery or naval gunfire, the bazooka demanded proximity. A man had to let the tank come close enough to see the commander's face in the turret. The instinct to run was overwhelming. Many who fired their first rockets swore they never wanted to do it again. Those who did so out of duty, not thrill. The psychological burden was immense. Infantrymen were trained to fight men, not machines. Facing a 7-ton armored vehicle with a shoulder tube felt like defying physics. After battles, Marines described a hollow silence, the ringing in their ears after firing, the disbelief that the massive shape they'd destroyed had been real. Some felt pride, others guilt. A few wrote in letters home that they had killed tanks the way men kill monsters. The Japanese, too, faced moral reckoning. Their tankers, once confident in their steel shells, began dreading each advance. They knew death could come unseen, from a shadow behind a log. The fear eroded discipline. Coordination broke down as crews hesitated to move forward. In that fragile space between man and machine, the bazooka introduced a new kind of warfare: intimate, personal, and psychological. It wasn't just about destruction, it was about belief. The belief that courage could level the field. Leadership, terrain, and morale had reshaped the balance. What began as an experiment was now rewriting combat across the Pacific. And soon, those lessons would be tested under fire in one of the fiercest tank engagements of the Island War. September 15, 1944, Peleliu, Palau Islands. The coral dust hung like fog. The sun was a white furnace. On the southern edge of the airfield, Marines of the 1st Division waited behind jagged rocks that shimmered with heat. The Japanese counterattack was coming. Moments earlier, reconnaissance reported armor moving through the tree line. Type 95 Hago tanks, maybe 10, supported by infantry. To the Marines, it sounded impossible. Peleliu was a coral rock barely 6 miles long. How could tanks even move here? Yet the engines were unmistakable. Metallic growls rising through the shimmering air. At 17:30 hours, they emerged. Small, squat silhouettes glinting in the sunlight. Dust swirled around their treads as they advanced in a staggered line. The Marines opened with rifle fire, but it pinged uselessly off the steel hulls. The tanks rolled forward undeterred. Bazooka teams moved into position. Private First Class Harold Keller and Corporal James Webb crawled behind a limestone ledge, carrying the green-painted launcher and 6 rockets wrapped in waxed paper. They waited, listening. The first Hago reached the airfield edge, its gun snapping off a shot that tore a crater in the sand. The concussion rattled the Marines' helmets. Webb loaded a rocket, a careful push until the connector clicked. Keller sighted in, exhaled, and pressed the trigger. The backblast scorched the coral behind them. The rocket streaked low and hit the tank square in the side. A dull explosion. Smoke poured from the turret. The vehicle lurched, stopped, and began burning. The rest of the column hesitated. A few tanks turned their guns toward the flash, blasting the ledge with high-explosive shells. Coral fragments cut into the Marines' faces, but they stayed put. Webb reloaded. Keller shifted position, fired again. Another direct hit. The second tank flamed. Now panic spread through the Japanese line. Infantry tried to rush forward, shouting, but machine gun fire from the Marine perimeter cut them down. The tanks, now isolated, began firing blindly into the dust. Farther along the ridge, other bazooka teams joined in. Rockets hissed from shell holes, from behind wrecked aircraft, from shallow trenches dug into coral. Each shot carried risk. Every backblast was a beacon. Some gunners were killed seconds after firing. Others kept going until they ran out of rockets. One Marine sergeant recalled later, "It was chaos. The tanks were so close I could smell the fuel burning. You couldn't hear your own voice. We just fired until they stopped moving." By nightfall, 6 Japanese tanks lay crippled or destroyed across the airfield. Their armor, once symbols of power, now burned quietly under the orange sky. The surviving tanks retreated into the jungle, engines sputtering, leaving trails of smoke behind them. The Americans had held, not with artillery or naval fire, but with tubes that commanders had once dismissed as experimental. That evening, as medics carried the wounded and the air cooled over the coral plain, officers walked among the wrecks. They examined the holes punched through the tank's sides, clean, circular penetrations about 2 inches wide. Inside, the interiors were charred and silent. One officer reportedly murmured, "They never saw it coming." The battlefield smelled of oil and ozone. The ground glittered with spent casings and shattered optics. For the first time in the Pacific, Japanese commanders understood that American infantry could now stop armor on their own. The toy rocket had become a tank killer. Reports of the engagement spread quickly through Marine headquarters. The after-action notes praised the bazooka's effectiveness, but warned of its limits: misfires, backblast exposure, and the need for teamwork. Yet in the margins of the report, one officer scrawled a single line: "Without them, Peleliu would have been overrun." The counterattack had failed. But for both sides, the lesson was far from over. The Japanese would not give up their tanks easily, and on the following day, they would return under the cover of darkness. The Marines rearmed, replaced shattered tubes, and prepared for what they knew would come. Night was falling again. Engines were already starting in the distance. Night, September 16, 1944. Peleliu. The airfield was dark now, broken only by the glow of scattered fires. Crickets had returned to the ridges, mingling with the faint clatter of cooling metal. Marines huddled in shallow foxholes, their ears tuned to every sound. Somewhere beyond the smoke, engines coughed to life. The Japanese were coming again. Shortly after 2100 hours, the counterattack began. A coordinated thrust of tanks and infantry moving along the airfield's southern flank. They came without headlights, guided by moonlight and shouted commands. For the men waiting in the dark, it was like listening to thunder approach. Bazooka teams took their positions. Each man knew his role: loader, gunner, spotter. They had stacked rockets within reach, ready to fire and move. The weapon was primitive, but the discipline was professional. The first tank appeared as a hulking shadow against the faint light of burning wreckage. It rolled forward slowly, treads clinking over coral. The Marines let it pass within 30 yards before firing. The rocket struck the side with a flash. A perfect hit. The explosion lit the field for a heartbeat. Then darkness returned. More tanks emerged. The air filled with tracers and shouting. Machine guns from both sides tore through the smoke. A second bazooka team fired and missed. Their rockets skimmed the hull and vanished into the trees. The tank's turret swung toward them, firing a shell that erased the position in a burst of flame and dust. The survivors shifted, crawling through shattered coral, finding new cover. Another team fired from a shell hole, scoring a hit that ignited a tank's engine deck. The flames spread fast, silhouetting the remaining vehicles like ghosts in orange light. For the Japanese, confusion set in. Their infantry, advancing behind the tanks, were caught in the open as the armor began to burn. Marine mortars joined in, thudding from the rear lines. The combination was devastating. Rockets from the front, explosives from above. Inside one of the tanks, a crew tried to pivot toward the flame, only for another bazooka round to punch through the side. The turret burst open like a furnace. Men leapt from the hatches, burning, stumbling into the night. The fire spread across spilled fuel, casting dancing light across the airfield. Amid the chaos, Corporal James Webb, the same Marine who had fought the day before, found himself with only one rocket left. He waited until a tank crested a coral ridge, exposing its underbelly, then fired. The round struck true. The explosion lifted the vehicle's rear off the ground, then dropped it back, motionless. Silence crept in after that. The surviving Japanese armor turned back toward the jungle, retreating under sporadic fire. The attack had collapsed. By dawn, the battlefield was littered with wrecks. 11 tanks destroyed or abandoned, dozens of infantry dead around them. The airfield, still scarred and smoking, remained in Marine hands. Engineers moved through the wreckage that morning, examining each vehicle. They noted where the rockets had struck, measuring the penetration marks. Some rounds had burned clean holes through 2 layers of armor. Others had entered through air vents, detonating fuel tanks from within. It was mechanical dissection, proof that the shaped charge worked even under field conditions. The Japanese commander on Peleliu later wrote in his final report, "Our tanks were rendered useless by a new American weapon, small in size but terrible in effect." That line, translated weeks later, was circulated through U.S. command channels as validation. The experiment had become doctrine. Infantry could kill armor without artillery. The battle for Peleliu was far from over. The fight for the ridges and caves would last weeks more. But the myth of Japanese tank invincibility had died on that airfield. For the men who fired those rockets, victory was measured in exhaustion, not celebration. Many never spoke of it again. They simply knew they had survived, and that something small and green had changed the rules of the war. As the sun rose over the shattered coral plain, Marines walked among the wrecks, their boots crunching on burnt glass and shell fragments. The tanks, once symbols of fear, now stood silent, blackened hulks against a white horizon. The toy rocket had spoken. From that day onward, both sides would fight differently. The aftermath would ripple far beyond Peleliu, into doctrine, design, and the very psychology of modern warfare. When the smoke cleared over Peleliu, the lessons were already being written. Reports from the 1st Marine Division detailed how a handful of men armed with bazookas had halted an armored counterattack that should have crushed them. The numbers told the story plainly. 11 Japanese tanks destroyed, dozens of infantry killed, and the airfield still under Marine control. To the officers reading the reports at headquarters, this wasn't just a battlefield success, it was a revelation. For decades, military logic had dictated that infantry alone could not stop tanks without artillery or air support. Peleliu proved otherwise. Commanders began to reorganize. Within weeks, U.S. Marine and Army units across the Pacific received new directives on anti-tank defense. Each rifle platoon was now to include 2 bazooka teams, properly supplied and trained to work in tandem. Field manuals were rewritten with fresh diagrams showing firing angles, backblast clearances, and the ideal flanking distances for jungle warfare. The soldiers adapted faster than the bureaucracy. They'd already learned the real lessons. Hide your tube until the last second, never fire from the same spot twice, and aim for the engine or the tracks, not the turret. The bazooka had become more than a tool. It was part of the infantryman's instinct, but not everything was triumph. The weapon's limitations were still deadly. The electric firing circuit remained vulnerable to moisture, and misfires were common in tropical humidity. Many Marines jury-rigged fixes with dry rags and improvised insulation, but accidents still happened. A rocket fired from too shallow an angle could ricochet or detonate prematurely. Despite this, the effect on morale was unmistakable. Where tanks once inspired dread, they now provoked determination. Infantry no longer scattered at the sound of treads. The psychological power of the tank, its aura of invincibility, had been broken. The Japanese, for their part, were forced to confront a bitter truth. Their tanks, designed for the flatlands of China, were hopelessly outmatched by new American firepower. Armor upgrades were ordered, thicker plates, reinforced turrets, but Japan's dwindling industrial capacity made them impossible to produce in meaningful numbers. Instead, Japanese commanders began to change tactics. Tanks were dug in as static bunkers, their hulls buried up to the turret, using the gun as a fixed defensive weapon. Others were deployed only at night, using limited visibility to avoid bazooka ambushes. But these were desperate adjustments, not solutions. The age of Japanese tank offense in the Pacific was effectively over. American analysts noted something deeper. The bazooka had forced an evolution in both sides' psychology. Infantrymen now viewed technology not as distant support, but as an extension of their will. Japanese troops, meanwhile, began to lose faith in their steel guardians. On Peleliu, the burned wrecks were left where they fell. They became landmarks, grim reminders of a shift in warfare. When correspondents visited weeks later, they described the tanks as blackened, carcasses under the white sun, silent testimonies to the power of innovation in desperate hands. It was here that the phrase toy rocket finally vanished from Allied vocabulary. In the official communiqué sent to Washington, the bazooka was listed not as an experiment, but as a standard infantry anti-armor weapon. The small green tube that had once been met with laughter had now earned respect through fire and sacrifice, and yet the war was still far from done. The islands ahead, Leyte, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, would test this newfound weapon in even bloodier conditions. Each battle would bring refinement, adaptation, and further proof that technology alone never wins. Men do. The Marines had rewritten the rules. But the full weight of their innovation would only be revealed in the months that followed, when the Japanese tanks came again, and the stakes rose even higher. By late 1944, the bazooka was no longer a curiosity. It was a cornerstone of U.S. infantry tactics. The weapon that began as a field experiment had now shaped doctrine from island jungles to European hedgerows. What the Marines proved at Peleliu, the Army would confirm across the Philippines and Luzon. A well-trained two-man team could stop armor, fortifications, or bunkers with terrifying efficiency. The Pacific became a proving ground for refinement. Ordnance engineers, analyzing captured Japanese armor, returned to the drawing board. They improved the warhead's fuse reliability and introduced the M9A1, a more durable, collapsible launcher with a better firing circuit and safer backblast venting. Its rockets carried stronger shaped charges, able to penetrate over 100 millimeters of armor, enough to burn through anything Japan could field. At the same time, training manuals evolved into precision guides. Marines were taught to measure backblast zones, to fire from low depressions, and to exploit defilade like hunters. Every squad learned to think in terms of interlocking fires, with bazooka teams anchoring the defense against both tanks and reinforced bunkers. The results were decisive. On Leyte in late 1944, Japanese armor tried to counterattack through muddy rice fields near Burauen. Dozens of Hagos and Chihas bogged down under rain-soaked terrain, becoming easy prey. Bazooka teams moved along the dikes, firing from short range. Reports listed entire platoons of Japanese tanks destroyed without a single American gun larger than 37 mm. By Okinawa in 1945, the bazooka had reached full maturity. The terrain there, ridges, caves, and kill zones, suited it perfectly. Marines used the weapon not just against tanks, but against pillboxes, cave mouths, and fortified gun positions. The same shaped charge that pierced armor could pulverize coral or concrete. In many instances, the bazooka replaced flamethrowers for close-range bunker clearing, offering reach and safety in the labyrinthine terrain. The Japanese armored forces, meanwhile, had faded into obsolescence. Fuel shortages and industrial collapse meant that only a few dozen tanks reached Okinawa, many stripped of spare parts. Most were destroyed within hours of contact. The once feared armor arm of the Imperial Japanese Army had become symbolic, brave, but doomed. Yet even as technology triumphed, its cost remained written on the faces of those who carried it. The Marines who survived Peleliu, Leyte, and Okinawa seldom spoke of their victories with pride. They remembered the smell of burnt steel, the cries inside the tanks, the white-hot flash that erased men in seconds. To them, the bazooka wasn't a marvel. It was a necessity, a means to survive what no one should face on foot. After the war, many veterans would recall the eerie quiet that followed each shot, the sudden end of mechanical noise, replaced by fire and stillness. In letters and diaries, the tone was rarely triumphant. It was matter-of-fact, almost reverent. They understood what it meant to wield that kind of power up close. In Tokyo, post-war analysis by Japanese officers confirmed what the battlefield had already revealed. Their official report, compiled in 1946, concluded, "The new American infantry rocket rendered all existing tank designs vulnerable. The only countermeasure is heavier armor, which Japan could not produce." It was a simple admission, and a final one. When the guns fell silent in August 1945, the bazooka had done more than destroy tanks. It had changed how wars were fought. From its simple tube of steel and copper came the lineage of all modern anti-tank weapons: the Panzerfaust, the RPG, the Law, the Javelin. But in 1944, on a sun-scorched coral airfield, none of that mattered. All that mattered was survival, and the small miracle that a toy rocket could turn the tide of a battle. The island fires dimmed, the wrecks rusted, and the world of warfare had changed forever. The Pacific War was a crucible of invention, a place where desperation forged new tools and courage gave them meaning. The bazooka was born from theory but proven by fear, carried by men who had no choice but to stand their ground when metal beasts advanced. To the Japanese, it was incomprehensible. To the Americans, it was salvation. And to history, it was the moment when the balance between man and machine shifted forever. The irony lingered long after the war. The same commanders who once dismissed it as a toy would have given anything to possess one. The weapon's simplicity, a tube, a wire, a shaped charge, belied its significance. It was not elegant, not flawless, but it democratized destruction. It handed power back to the soldier in the mud. Technology, for all its steel and voltage, has always been a human story. On Peleliu, New Georgia, and Okinawa, the bazooka was not the triumph of machinery. It was the triumph of will, the courage to wait, to aim, and to fire in the face of something designed to crush you. When historians walk those islands today, the coral still hides fragments of burned metal, pieces of tanks, shards of rockets, melted glass, silent remnants of a moment when warfare changed direction. The toy rocket became a symbol of ingenuity, but also of humility, proof that no weapon is ever small when wielded by those who refuse to yield. And so the story ends as it began, in the heat, the smoke, and the stillness after impact. A weapon born from doubt, carried by faith, and remembered not for its noise, but for the quiet that followed. History remembers the great weapons, the tanks, the bombers, the fleets. But sometimes, it's the smallest invention that changes everything. The bazooka, a tube, a rocket, and a handful of men who refuse to run. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe history should be told not through myth, but through truth, then stand with us. Subscribe to keep this history alive. Share it, so their courage is never forgotten.